Celeste Harrington laughed the moment she saw the rusted tin hangar belonging to Elias Rowan, telling her operations chief that the place was not even worthy of washing the landing gear on her fleet of 300 private jets. But the woman in the tailored silk blazer had no idea that the quiet man wiping his hands on an oil-stained rag had once been the only engineer authorized to certify the safety of the very engine line powering her entire empire. The next morning, a single signature from Elias placed every one of those 300 aircraft on mandatory ground hold, and for the first time in her life, Celeste Harrington understood what it meant to lose the right to fly. If you love satisfying reversals where the arrogant pay the ultimate price, hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next story. The sky over western Kansas hung low and heavy that Thursday afternoon, a ceiling of iron-gray clouds stretching from horizon to horizon, as if the atmosphere itself wanted nothing more to do with flying. Inside the cockpit of Harrington I, the flagship Gulfstream of Harrington Aerolux, Captain Derek Nash watched the amber caution light blink twice, then hold steady, and his hands tightened on the yoke as the master warning system confirmed what the light suggested. An abnormal pressure reading inside the starboard engine's turbine section, the kind of anomaly no pilot could legally ignore at 37,000 feet. He radioed the nearest suitable field, a modest regional strip outside a town called Ashford Plains, and began his descent while the cabin crew scrambled to inform their only passenger that New York would have to wait. Celeste Harrington stood from her cream leather seat, pressed one manicured finger against the intercom, and demanded an explanation in a voice that made it clear explanations were merely a courtesy she tolerated before issuing consequences. Dawson Vale, her director of fleet operations, leaned across the aisle and assured her the situation was minor, probably a sensor glitch, something any competent ground crew could reset in 20 minutes so they could be airborne again before dinner reservations expired. Celeste checked her watch and calculated the margin. Wesley Blackwood, the billionaire whose global conference circuit required a fleet contract worth $900 million, expected her in his Manhattan office by 9 that evening, and every minute spent descending toward a Kansas cornfield was a minute closer to losing the single largest deal in Harrington Aerolux history. The Gulfstream touched down with a whisper of rubber on cracked asphalt, rolled past a faded windsock, and taxied toward the only hangar on the field, a structure so small and weather-beaten that Celeste pressed her face to the window and let out a short, incredulous laugh before turning to Dawson and saying the place looked more like a hay barn than an aviation facility. Elias Rowan heard the jet before he saw it, the distinctive whistle of twin FalconMark IX engines cutting through the late afternoon quiet of Ashford Plains Municipal Airport. He set down the torque wrench he had been using on a Cessna's propeller hub, wiped his palms on the rag that lived permanently in his back pocket, and walked out onto the ramp just as the sleek white Gulfstream swung its nose toward his hangar, its paint gleaming against the dull landscape like a diamond dropped into a gravel pit. The name on the fuselage read Harrington Aerolux in gold script, and Elias recognized it immediately, not because he followed the world of luxury aviation, but because the FalconMark IX engines bolted beneath those swept wings were the same power plants he had spent 4 years of his life certifying before he walked away from that world entirely. The forward door opened and a woman descended the air stairs as though each step cost her dignity, her heels clicking against aluminum, her gaze sweeping the hangar's rusted roof, the cracked concrete apron, and the faded sign that read Rowan Aviation Service with the quiet disdain of someone appraising property she intended to demolish. Behind her came a tall man in a charcoal suit, who immediately pulled out a phone and began making calls, and behind him came 2 crew members carrying luggage that probably cost more than every tool in Elias's shop combined. Celeste stopped 3 paces from Elias, looked him up and down, from his scuffed boots to his oil-streaked jacket, and asked in a tone balanced precisely between amusement and contempt whether he had ever actually touched a real private jet before. Elias did not flinch, did not smile, did not offer the kind of eager deference she clearly expected from anyone standing on ground this humble. He simply glanced past her at the Gulfstream's starboard nacelle, noted the faint heat shimmer still rising from the exhaust, and said that if she wanted to leave this runway safely, it would be best to let him look at the engine before anyone talked about departure times. Celeste followed Elias into the hangar as though entering a museum of poverty, her eyes cataloging every imperfection with the precision of an auditor marking deficiencies on a balance sheet. She noted the steel shelving units bolted to the walls, their surfaces cluttered with gaskets, filters, and labeled bins of hardware that looked like they had been organized by someone who cared deeply about function and not at all about appearance. And she noted the concrete floor with its network of old cracks filled with black sealant, and the two small propeller aircraft parked in the far bay with their cowlings removed like patients mid-surgery, and she turned to Dawson with a thin smile and said the entire hangar was smaller than the changing suite aboard her personal jet. Dawson laughed on cue, the practiced laugh of a man whose career depended on finding his boss amusing, and then he approached Elias with the brisk authority of someone accustomed to making problems disappear before they reached the executive floor. He told Elias the situation was simple. The master warning had flagged a pressure anomaly, almost certainly a sensor fault, and all they needed was for Elias to clear the caution message from the maintenance computer and sign a temporary airworthiness release, so the aircraft could continue to New York. Elias shook his head slowly, explaining that the warning was tied to the turbine pressure and temperature sensor cluster, a system that did not typically produce false alerts on the FalconMark IX unless something upstream had changed, and he was not willing to clear a warning he had not diagnosed. Celeste's patience evaporated like fuel on hot tarmac. She stepped forward and reminded Elias that Harrington Aerolux operated 300 private jets serving billionaires, heads of state, and film industry royalty across 4 continents, and that a small-town mechanic in Kansas did not have the authority or the standing to delay her schedule by a single minute. Elias turned back to the maintenance terminal he had already connected to the aircraft's diagnostic port, scrolled through the fault log, and noticed something that made him pause. The same pressure anomaly had been flagged and manually dismissed 4 times. In the previous 60 days, each dismissal carrying a maintenance code that indicated the alert had been classified as a nuisance warning rather than investigated. He asked Dawson about the aircraft's service history, and Dawson's answer came a half-beat too late, wrapped in the vague assurance that all records were maintained at corporate headquarters in New York and were not his to share on a Kansas tarmac. Celeste placed a gold-embossed business card on the workbench beside Elias's diagnostic laptop and told him to sign the release, adding that she would give him enough money to replace that pathetic tin roof and every piece of rusted equipment underneath it. Elias looked at the card, then looked at the data still scrolling on his screen, and replied with the calm of a man who had long ago decided that his name on a document meant more than any amount printed on a check. He would not sign for an aircraft he did not yet believe should leave the ground. What Celeste Harrington did not know, and what Dawson Vale had failed to discover in his hasty background search during the taxi from runway to hangar, was that Elias Rowan was not simply a small-town aircraft mechanic who happened to own a modest repair shop on a forgotten Kansas airfield. Before the hangar, before Ashford Plains, before the quiet life he had built among wheat fields and wide skies, Elias had been a senior certification engineer at Asterion Aerospace, the firm that designed, tested, and delivered the FalconMark IX turbofan engine to every airframe manufacturer that mounted it. including the company that built every Gulfstream in the Harrington fleet. He had spent 4 years inside Asterion's propulsion laboratory, running thermal stress simulations, signing off on metallurgical analyses, and working alongside a team of 11 engineers who tested every component of that engine from the fan blades to the exhaust nozzle until they could predict its behavior in conditions that most pilots would never encounter, but that regulations demanded be accounted for. When the certification process concluded, it was Elias's name that appeared on the final safety authorization document, the signature that told the world the FalconMark IX was fit to carry human lives at altitude, a credential that regulatory bodies, insurance underwriters, and engine manufacturers still recognized as the gold standard for that generation of power plant, a credential that could not be transferred, delegated, or revoked by anyone outside the certification authority itself. A family crisis had pulled him away from that world. His wife's passing from a sudden illness had left him the sole parent of a teenage daughter, and the 60-hour weeks and constant travel demanded by Asterion were incompatible with raising a child who needed stability more than she needed a father with an impressive title. He had taken June, sold the house outside Hartford, and moved to Kansas where the cost of living was low, the sky was enormous, and a man with his skills could keep a small hangar running while still being home for dinner every evening. That evening, as if summoned by the thought of her, June called from her dormitory at the State University. Her voice bright and hurried, asking whether he would make it to the online parent-faculty meeting, scheduled for 8 o'clock. Elias glanced at the Harrington jet parked in his hangar and told her he might be a few minutes late, but he would be there. And the gentleness in his voice as he said goodnight stood in sharp contrast to the steel he had shown Celeste minutes earlier. What mattered now, what Celeste and Dawson had not grasped, was that Elias still held a specific and potent authority. His certification signature on the FalconMark IX first-generation engine line carried the legal weight to trigger a mandatory operational pause if he identified a systemic defect pattern, a power granted not by ego or ambition, but by the simple regulatory fact that he was the last living signatory on that engine's original safety dossier. He did not want a war with Harrington Aerolux. He did not want headlines or courtroom drama. He wanted Ed only to follow the procedure he had sworn to uphold, but as he returned to the diagnostic terminal and cross-referenced the fault codes from the Harrington 1 against archived data from other FalconMark IX installations, a pattern emerged that turned a single aircraft anomaly into something far more alarming. Identical pressure-temperature deviations had been logged across multiple airframes, and every one of them had been dismissed without investigation. Celeste returned to the hangar 40 minutes later, with the controlled fury of a woman who had just been told that her future depended on a man she considered beneath her. Her phone call with Wesley Blackwood had not gone well. The billionaire had reminded her, in the polite but unmistakable language of someone accustomed to being courted rather than kept waiting, that if she was not seated across from him in his Manhattan penthouse office by midnight, his legal team would begin preliminary discussions with a competing charter company whose fleet had never been grounded by a sensor warning on a Kansas prairie. She walked straight to Elias's workbench, planted both hands on its scarred surface, and told him in a voice stripped of all pretense that he would sign the airworthiness release immediately or face consequences that would make his little tin roof operation disappear from the aviation registry before sunrise. Dawson appeared beside her carrying a document he had clearly prepared during the interval, a pre-drafted maintenance release that required only Elias's signature to certify that the flagged anomaly posed no threat to flight safety, and as Elias took the paper and read it under the fluorescent lights of his shop, he recognized immediately what it was: a liability transfer disguised as a routine sign-off, a document engineered so that if anything went wrong after departure, every ounce of legal responsibility would fall on the shoulders of a single mechanic in Ashford Plains, Kansas, while Harrington Aerolux and its executives walked away clean. Elias set the document down on the bench but did not pick up the pen. He looked at Celeste with an expression that held neither anger nor fear, only the weary certainty of a man who had seen this exact play before, and he said something that made the color drain from Dawson's face. She did not need his signature because he was poor or insignificant. She needed it because out there, scattered across airports on both coasts and everywhere in between, 300 jets were carrying the same flaw, and his name was the only name that could make that fact official. Celeste froze. Her retort caught somewhere between reflex and comprehension, and in the silence Dawson moved quickly, calling Elias's claim reckless extortion, insisting that the fleet had passed every scheduled inspection, and demanding that Celeste authorize their legal team to pursue immediate action against Rowan Aviation Service for unlawful detention of a Harrington aircraft. But Elias had already copied the diagnostic data to a secure drive, had already documented the pattern of dismissed alerts, and had already composed a preliminary message to the one person whose authority in this matter matched his own. The confrontation ended not with a shout, but with a departure. Celeste chartered a replacement aircraft from a competing service, and as she climbed the air stairs, she turned back toward the hangar, pointed one finger at the faded sign above the door, and said that it would be the last thing Elias Rowan ever owned. The hangar was quiet after they left. Quiet in the way that only a building surrounded by open prairie can be, with nothing but wind against corrugated metal and the distant hum of a highway to fill the emptiness. Elias sat at his desk in the small glass-walled office at the back of the shop, the glow of his monitor the only light in the building, and he worked through the data with the methodical patience of a man who understood that what he was about to do could not be undone. He pulled the full diagnostic archive from the Harrington I's maintenance computer and laid it alongside the original test data from the FalconMark IX certification program, data he had kept on encrypted drives, not out of paranoia, but out of the professional habit of an engineer who believed records were sacred. The pattern was unambiguous. A thermal drift in the turbine pressure sensors was causing the engine management system to misread operating temperatures under specific high-altitude cruise conditions, and if the drift exceeded a critical threshold, the automated power management could reduce thrust at precisely the wrong moment, during climb-out, during go-around, during any phase of flight where the loss of even 5% thrust could mean the difference between a routine departure and a catastrophe. He picked up his phone and called Madeline Cross, a name he had not dialed in nearly 3 years, and when she answered he could hear the background noise of an airport terminal, which meant she was already on assignment somewhere. Madeline listened without interruption, asked 2 precise technical questions, and then told him what he already knew. If he believed the defect was systemic, affecting not just one aircraft but potentially every airframe equipped with first-generation FalconMark IX engines, then he had both the authority and the obligation to file a formal safety report, and she would ensure it reached the correct desks within hours of submission. Elias hesitated, not because he doubted the data, but because he understood the scale of what he was about to set in motion, the grounding of an entire fleet, the disruption of a billion-dollar enterprise, the fury of powerful people who would view his signature not as a safety measure, but as an act of war. While he sat in that silence, his phone chimed with an email from Dawson Vale, a message threatening legal action for unauthorized retention of a Harrington aircraft, a message so aggressive in tone and so careless in its demands that it effectively became evidence that Harrington's own operations director had attempted to coerce a certified engineer into bypassing safety protocols. Elias set the phone beside the framed photograph of himself in June that sat on the corner of his desk, the one taken the day they arrived in Kansas with everything they owned packed into a rented truck, and he opened the formal reporting interface, typed his credentials, attached his data, and signed the document with the authority that the aviation world had granted him years ago and never revoked. Elias Rowan, Certified FalconMark IX Safety Authority. At exactly 5:40 the next morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern tree line, the insurance networks, the flight coordination systems, and the regulatory databases all received the same notification. In Miami, a Harrington Gulfstream that had been prepped for a sunrise departure to the Bahamas went dark on the dispatch board. In Dallas, 2 jets scheduled to carry energy executives to a conference in Houston were towed back to their hangars by ground crews who had received the alert on their tablets before the pilots even arrived for briefing. In Los Angeles, a flight crew standing on the tarmac at Van Nuys watched their aircraft's status change from cleared to grounded in real time, the word appearing on their screens like a verdict. In Teterboro, the gateway airport for Manhattan's wealthiest travelers, 4 Harrington jets sat in a row on the executive ramp, their engines cold, their cabins dark, their schedules erased. Across the country, 300 private jets bearing the Harrington Aerolux livery were simultaneously reclassified to mandatory safety review status, their flight clearances suspended pending a full FalconMark IX inspection, and not a single one of them would carry a passenger or burn a gallon of fuel until the review was complete. The morning that followed was the kind of morning that corporate crisis management teams spend years training for, rehearsing in tabletop exercises and war room simulations, and praying with every quarterly report that it never actually arrives. At Harrington Aerolux headquarters on Park Avenue, phones began ringing before the first pot of coffee finished brewing, and they did not stop. VIP clients who had booked flights for that day discovered that their aircraft were unavailable, their itineraries voided, their assumptions about the reliability of the Harrington name shattered by a terse automated message, informing them that their scheduled departure had been suspended pending a safety review. Charter brokers who served as intermediaries between Harrington and its wealthiest customers called the operations center in waves, each call angrier than the last, each demanding answers that nobody on the floor was authorized to give. Aviation trade journalists, tipped off by sources at regional airports who had noticed an unusual number of Harrington jets sitting idle on ramps, began filing inquiries with the company's communications office, and within 2 hours the phrase "Harrington Fleet Grounded" was circulating through industry channels with the velocity of genuine scandal. Celeste was already in New York, already dressed for the meeting she had rescheduled with Wesley Blackwood to that morning, and she walked into his glass-walled conference room on the 52nd floor of a midtown tower with the practiced confidence of a woman who had never entered a room she did not control, but she had barely extended her hand before Wesley's assistant placed a tablet on the table showing a news alert, and Wesley, whose fortune had been built on logistics and who understood supply chains the way surgeons understand anatomy, looked at her with an expression that was not angry but something worse, something genuinely curious, and asked whether a single man operating out of a small hangar had just accomplished what her entire board of directors could not. Celeste attempted recovery, straightening her posture and adopting the measured tone she used when quarterly earnings disappointed analysts, calling the grounding a procedural formality triggered by an outdated certification protocol that would be resolved within 48 hours. But Wesley Blackwood had not built a fortune spanning 3 continents by accepting explanations that insulted his intelligence. He leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and told her plainly that until she could provide independently verified proof that every aircraft assigned to his account met current safety standards, The $900 million contract would remain unsigned, and he suggested, with the quiet precision of a man delivering a final warning, that she redirect the considerable energy she was spending on reassurance toward actually solving the problem before his legal team began conversations with her competitors. Across town, Sterling Harrington, Celeste's father and chairman of the Harrington Aerolux board, convened an emergency session by secure video link, his voice carrying the particular authority of a patriarch who had built the family's aviation empire from a single leased turboprop 40 years earlier and was not about to watch it crumble because of what Dawson Vale was now describing as a disgruntled small-town mechanic seeking publicity. But the narrative Dawson tried to sell collapsed within minutes. Madeline Cross had already transmitted her independent verification, confirming that Elias Rowan's report met every procedural and technical standard, that his certification authority over the FalconMark IX first-generation engine remained fully valid, and that the data he had submitted was sufficiently serious to justify the operational pause. Sterling sat in silence for a long moment after Madeline's statement was read into the record, and when he spoke again, his voice had lost its indignation and gained something closer to dread because he understood, as only a man who had spent 4 decades in aviation could, that the name Elias Rowan had just become the most consequential name in Harrington's corporate history. Celeste Harrington had not flown commercial in over a decade, and the experience of standing in a security line at LaGuardia, removing her shoes, placing her handbag in a gray plastic bin, and shuffling forward behind 200 strangers while a TSA agent waved her through a body scanner was a form of humiliation that no boardroom defeat could replicate. She boarded the regional jet to Kansas, found her middle seat between a sleeping college student whose headphones leaked tinny music and a man eating a turkey sandwich from a plastic bag, and sat down with the rigid posture of someone enduring a punishment she knew she deserved but would never admit aloud. The irony was precise and merciless. The chief executive of a company that operated 300 private jets could not use a single one of them, and the reason she could not was a man she had mocked for owning a tin-roofed hangar. She arrived at Ashford Plains in a rental car, drove past the faded airport sign, and parked on the cracked apron in front of Rowan Aviation Service for the second time. But the woman who stepped out of that car bore little resemblance to the one who had descended the Gulfstream stairs 2 days earlier. The mockery was gone from her face, replaced by a guarded tension that she tried to disguise as authority, but that Elias recognized immediately as the expression of someone who had run out of options and was trying to negotiate from a position she no longer held. She offered money, a significant sum, enough to fund Rowan Aviation Service for a generation, in exchange for Elias withdrawing his report. But Elias told her what any engineer in his position would have said. The report had entered the regulatory system, it had been independently verified, and no amount of money could extract it, because the system was designed precisely to prevent wealth from overriding safety. Celeste's composure cracked, and she asked him with genuine frustration what he actually wanted, and Elias answered without raising his voice. He wanted every aircraft in the Harrington fleet inspected properly. He wanted the real maintenance records opened for independent review. And he wanted Harrington to stop pressuring technicians into signing off on work that had not been completed. Dawson, who had accompanied Celeste on the flight back, stepped forward with renewed aggression, accusing Elias of manufacturing a crisis to extort a corporation. But Elias had prepared for this moment. He turned his laptop towards Celeste and showed her what the diagnostic data revealed. Dozens of Harrington jets had triggered the same pressure-temperature warning over the previous 18 months, and in every case Dawson's operations team had classified the alert as sensor noise and cleared the aircraft for flight without performing the physical inspection that the warning demanded. The pattern was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation. It was a systematic practice of dismissing safety alerts to protect flight schedules and VIP client satisfaction, and the documentation trail led directly to Dawson's department. Celeste stared at the screen, and Elias watched the realization move across her face like a shadow crossing a field. She had not only been stopped by an outsider, she had been deceived by her own people. And while her arrogance had created the conditions for the deception to thrive, the deception itself ran deeper than her pride and had roots in the operational culture that Dawson had built beneath her notice. The emergency board meeting convened at 10 the following morning, conducted over an encrypted video link that connected Sterling Harrington in his Connecticut estate, Celeste in the cramped office of a Kansas airport hotel, 4 independent board members in various time zones, and, at Celeste's reluctant invitation, Elias Rowan and Madeline Cross from the workbench of Rowan Aviation Service, the laptop camera framing Elias against a backdrop of tool racks and engine parts that looked almost deliberately humble beside the mahogany bookshelves and oil paintings visible behind Sterling. The patriarch opened the meeting with a proposal that he clearly believed would end the crisis quickly. Harrington Aerolux would purchase Rowan Aviation Service at a price generous enough to make Elias wealthy for life, and in exchange, Elias would step back from the certification process and allow Harrington's own engineering team to manage the fleet review internally. Elias declined without hesitation. And his refusal was not theatrical or aggressive. He simply stated that the issue was not about his hangar, not about money, and not about personal grievance, but about 300 aircraft that might be flying with maintenance records that had been manipulated to hide a recurring defect, and that allowing the company responsible for the manipulation to oversee its own correction was not a solution but a continuation of the problem. Dawson seized the opening, attempting to undermine Elias by noting that he had voluntarily left Asterion Aerospace years ago, implying without quite saying that his departure had been something less than voluntary, suggesting that a man who had abandoned the industry lacked the standing to challenge a company that had remained in it. Madeline Cross intervened immediately, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who had spent 20 years conducting investigations that ended careers, and she confirmed on the record that Elias Rowan's FalconMark IX certification credentials remained active, valid, and recognized by every regulatory body and insurance underwriter in the Western Hemisphere. Elias then shared his screen and walked the board through a presentation that he had assembled with the same meticulous care he applied to engine inspections, each slide stripped of rhetoric and built entirely on data that could not be argued away. He showed them a chronological sequence of dismissed warnings, 47 in total over 18 months, each one time-stamped and tagged with the maintenance code that Dawson's team had used to classify genuine safety alerts as sensor malfunctions without ever opening an engine cowling to verify. He showed them the scheduled service intervals that had been extended by 30 to 60 days without documentation or engineering justification, intervals that existed for a reason, and that Dawson's team had treated as suggestions rather than requirements. He showed them instances where junior technicians' signatures had been applied to sign-offs that exceeded their authorization level, young mechanics who had been told to sign or be replaced, and who had chosen their mortgages over their consciences. And he showed them a list of VIP flights that had departed with incomplete pre-flight inspections because the client's schedule had been deemed more important than the checklist. Flights carrying passengers who had trusted Harrington with their lives and whose trust had been quietly betrayed every time a departure clock overruled an inspection protocol. The boardroom fell silent, the kind of silence that descends when every person in a room simultaneously realizes that the situation is worse than they feared and that denial is no longer an option. Sterling Harrington, whose instinct for self-preservation had been honed by 4 decades of navigating regulatory scrutiny, understood immediately that if the board chose to fight Elias rather than cooperate with him, the consequences would escalate from a temporary grounding to a permanent loss of operating certificates, insurance coverage, and public trust. Elias spoke once more, and what he said shifted the entire emotional register of the meeting. He had not filed the report to destroy Harrington Aerolux. He had filed it because if even one of those 300 jets suffered an in-flight failure, the first people to bear the blame would not be the executives in their corner offices, but the low-level technicians who had been pressured into signing documents they knew were incomplete, the same technicians whose names appeared on those falsified records. Because they had been too afraid of losing their jobs to refuse. And Elias knew exactly what that felt like because he had watched it happen before at another company, to another group of engineers who had been silenced until silence became complicity, and complicity became tragedy. And he had promised himself that, if he ever held the authority to prevent it from happening again, he would use it regardless of the cost. Dawson Vale was suspended from all operational duties before the meeting ended. Celeste, for the first time in the memory of anyone on that call, did not defend one of her own people. In the days that followed the board meeting, the reality of Harrington Aerolux's position became impossible to ignore, and Celeste found herself in the unfamiliar posture of asking for help from someone she had tried to destroy. She came to the hangar without Dawson, without lawyers, without the armor of corporate authority, and she asked Elias a question that contained no threat and no manipulation. Was there a way to restore the fleet without compromising safety? Elias had already considered this, because despite everything that had happened, he was not interested in watching an airline collapse or seeing thousands of employees lose their livelihoods over the failures of a handful of executives. He proposed a 3-phase recovery plan. The first phase would prioritize 60 aircraft with the lowest risk profiles, replacing their faulty sensor clusters and conducting full engine inspections before returning them to service. The second phase would process groups of 40 aircraft at a time through the same protocol, and the third phase would address the remaining jets, including those with the most complex maintenance histories. He made one condition clear. He would not issue a blanket clearance for the entire fleet at once, because a blanket clearance was exactly the kind of shortcut that had created the problem in the first place. Celeste agreed, and she signed an independent oversight agreement granting Rowan Aviation Service full supervisory authority over the entire inspection and recertification process, a document that transformed the relationship between the two parties in a way that neither could have imagined 48 hours earlier. The hangar she had called a tin-roofed hay barn was now the nerve center of a safety operation governing a billion-dollar fleet. Wesley Blackwood, who had been monitoring the situation through his own network of aviation contacts, called Celeste that afternoon and said something that surprised her. He was not canceling the contract negotiations, because a company willing to publicly acknowledge its failures and submit to independent oversight demonstrated a kind of integrity that mattered more to him than the polished image Harrington had always projected. And integrity, he added, was the one thing money could not manufacture. 3 days after the grounding order, Elias signed his second document, not a report that shut down an empire but a clearance certificate that returned the first 12 aircraft to service after they had passed every test he and Madeline's team could devise. And Celeste watched him write his name on that form and understood something she had been too proud to see before. The same hand that had frozen her fleet could also set it free, and the difference between destruction and salvation had never been about power but about whether power was exercised with integrity or without it. 1 week after the grounding that shook the private aviation industry, The small airport at Ashford Plains saw more visitors than it had received in the previous 5 years combined. Aviation trade journalists arrived with camera crews, parked their rental cars on the grass beside the taxiway, and pointed their lenses at the same rusted hangar that Celeste Harrington had once compared to a storage shed. Celeste herself stood before that hangar, not on a stage, not behind a podium, not surrounded by the corporate choreography that typically accompanied Harrington public appearances, but on the cracked concrete apron with the faded Rowan Aviation Service sign visible over her shoulder, and she delivered a statement that her communications team had urged her not to make, and that her father had advised her to soften, but that she delivered in full because she had learned, in the span of 7 days, that softening the truth was precisely the habit that had brought her company to its knees. She acknowledged publicly that Harrington Aerolux had failed to maintain adequate safety oversight of its fleet, that the corporate culture she had fostered had prioritized client schedules and revenue targets over the inspection protocols that existed to protect human lives, and that the systemic deficiency had been identified not by Harrington's own engineering department, not by its board of directors, not by its fleet of corporate lawyers, but by a single independent certification authority operating from a modest facility on a rural Kansas airfield, a facility that she herself had dismissed as beneath her standards, and whose owner she had personally attempted to intimidate into silence. She thanked Rowan Aviation Service by name and stated that its intervention had potentially prevented a catastrophic failure that would have cost lives. Sterling Harrington quietly stepped back from all fleet operations oversight, retaining his board chairmanship in title, but ceding operational authority to a restructured safety division that reported directly to an independent committee. Dawson Vale was placed under formal internal investigation, stripped of his title and all operational authority, barred from any future role involving aircraft certification or maintenance scheduling, and escorted from the building by security personnel who had once opened doors for him. Madeline Cross accepted a formal appointment as independent safety monitor for the duration of the fleet recertification, a role that gave her full access to every maintenance record, every flight log, and every personnel file in Harrington's operations division. And Wesley Blackwood, true to his word, signed the fleet contract, but with an amendment that his lawyers drafted and Celeste's lawyers accepted without negotiation. Every Harrington aircraft assigned to Blackwood's account would carry a safety certification bearing either the personal signature of Elias Rowan or the signature of a designee appointed by him, a clause that effectively made a small-town hangar operator the final authority over a billionaire's travel safety. The last camera crew left Ashford Plains on a Friday afternoon, and by evening the airport had returned to its usual stillness, the kind of quiet that most people would call empty, but that Elias Rowan had always considered full of space, full of sky, full of the particular peace that comes from knowing exactly who you are and refusing to become anything else. He was back at his workbench, hands busy with a routine inspection on a crop duster whose owner would pick it up Monday morning, when one of the junior mechanics he had recently hired asked him whether he planned to accept the Harrington board's offer to relocate to a larger facility, a proper complex with climate-controlled bays and corporate signage and the Harrington name beside his own. Elias looked up at the tin roof above him, the same roof Celeste had mocked, the same roof that had sheltered his work and his principles through years of quiet obscurity, and he smiled the way a man smiles when he has been offered something impressive and knows with perfect clarity that he does not need it. He told the young mechanic that the building was fine the way it was, and then he looked back down at the engine he was inspecting, his hands moving with the practiced ease of a man who had been doing this work long enough to know that the work itself was the reward. Outside, the Kansas wind pushed against the hangar walls with the same patient force it had exerted every day since Elias had first opened the doors, and the tin roof held, as it always had, because it did not need to be grand to be strong. The people who needed to find him had found him, and the ones who had underestimated him had learned what he already knew. That sometimes the thing holding the entire sky in place starts from a very small place, and what matters is not the size of the roof, but the weight of the name signed beneath it.